Today on The State of Us, low wages cost a high price. Who is really winning? Welcome to The State of Us. For decades, the U.S. has used wage subsidies to support the country's lowest paid workers, a welfare system that keeps the poor down, primarily benefits the wealthy, and undermines technological innovation. That's according to an opinion piece in the Wall Street Journal by Michael Lind. Again, welcome. I'm your host, Justin T. Weller, joined today by the one and only, your friendly redneck liberal and the senior resident historian here at True Chat, Mr. Lance Jackson.
Well, this is a deep one. This is an excerpt from his upcoming book, and he delves into it and I think approaches it very well. And you're going to have to really, I know I read the article twice, so, I'm going to give you a little bit of what I got from it, but there's a lot there to digest, and we're not probably going to give it its due diligence, but we're going to try, because he brings up what I feel are some very interesting points, both from a historical standpoint and how we are hurting people when many of us are thinking, well, I'm doing this because I want to help people. And so it really makes you take a look at what maybe we should be doing and who are the real beneficiaries of this reaching out to help folks in the way that we do it. Doesn't mean we shouldn't help people, but maybe the way that we've decided to do it needs to be looked at and possibly changed.
One of the things this piece does well, Lance, and that's why I hope everybody will keep listening, is it talks about why Republicans and Democrats have basically held up this system for an extended period. Different reasons, but that doesn't mean that it's good that it's being supported. We always talk about, well, if it's bipartisan, maybe it's a good thing. A lot of times that's true. This time it might not be. And that's part of what we want to look at today. So some people probably know Adam Smith, who's kind of the, regarded as the founding member of free market economics when he wrote The Wealth of Nations. But the author of this article, Michael Lind, points out that he may have overlooked something when he said a man must always live by his work and his wages must at least be sufficient to maintain him. They must even, upon most occasions, be somewhat more, otherwise it would be impossible for him to bring up a family, and the race of such workmen could not last beyond the first generation. In the last half century, policymakers of both parties in the U.S. have successfully refuted Adam Smith's free market economics. It turns out that it is indeed possible to pay wages to workers that are too low for their own maintenance, much less that of their families. This depends on using means-tested welfare programs like, and this will be the focus today, the Earned Income Tax Credit, the EITC, which also includes things like food stamps, housing vouchers, all of which compensate for wages that are too low for workers to live on. Since its creation in 1975, the EITC, a federal wage subsidy for low-income workers and their children, has been expanded repeatedly under Democratic and Republican presidents alike. Many states have also their own versions of the EITC. Liberals like the EITC because it reduces absolute poverty. I want to pause there real quick just to talk to listeners about what do we mean when we say absolute poverty, because he doesn't actually, in this excerpt, he doesn't explain that.
Talk about it, right?
But I think what they're referring to here is the notion that absolute poverty would be just the raw number of people, right, who are living at a standard below whatever we consider to be the poverty line. So why they're not living below that line doesn't matter. It's just, are you living below that line or not? So if you're not living in absolute poverty, even if it's because half of your income is subsidized by the government, you're not in absolute poverty. So you've reduced the absolute poverty. Have you actually reduced poverty? Well, that's kind of part of the question of today's show. You've reduced the standard by which we try to measure it. And conservatives like the EITC because it attaches a work requirement to welfare. That's why they like it. In order to get it, and that's part of why, think about the name, Earned Income Tax Credit. The name is supposed to suggest that you get this because you've earned it.
But the bottom line is you receive this because the job at which you are working is not paying you a living wage, right? I mean, to me, that sums it up. Is that fair? Because you wouldn't get it otherwise. You don't qualify for it according to the government. You have to qualify for it. So number one, you have to have a job, but your job has to pay you so little that the government's going to give you things.
They're going to subsidize your pay,
raise your standard of living so that you're above the poverty level. So what you're doing is you're working your 40 hours a week, but not making enough money to live at the poverty level. And so we've created this welfare program to raise you above poverty if you're going to work. And the whole point of the article is, why are we doing that? Shouldn't you, if you're going to work every day and you're working hard and you're doing your job well, shouldn't you be on your own without government intervention, earning enough money to take care of you and your family? Maybe not at the level you want to live, but above the poverty level?
Well, when you think about it, right, you can see how we've accidentally fallen into this trap. It sounds like on the surface a good idea, right? We don't want people. I mean, I think generally speaking, if you ask the average American, do you want Americans to live in poverty? No. I mean, generally, right? No. The answer is we don't want people.
But where you get the bipartisan is, add to that question, do you want to see people living in poverty who are going to work every day?
Right.
And then I think you have 100%. Yeah. Whether you're a Democrat, Republican, an independent, whatever.
If somebody's working,
98%
they shouldn't be living in poverty.
I'm sure there's 2 or 3% out there that would say, well, whatever. But by a huge majority, we would all say, well, no, if somebody's going to work every day, they should be making enough money to live above the poverty level anyway. Yeah, that doesn't happen, does it?
Right. I mean, exactly. People would probably be baffled.
You mean there's somebody who's going to work 40 hours a week and
they can't.
They're not making enough to live above the poverty level? Guess what, folks? In the great United States, that is a fact. And we have...
Right. And we decided we didn't want that.
We didn't want it.
So there are different ways to solve that. One way would have been for the government to do nothing, right? And say the market will do whatever it's going to do. Those jobs will disappear or they'll get outsourced, right? Or they'll become more efficient somehow so that we can afford to pay somebody to do that job. Whatever is going to happen, something's going to happen. However, that takes time, right? And time equals pain and suffering for people. So we put in place a system that said, well, if you're working, then you certainly shouldn't, which I think we all agree, right, at a basic level that if you're working full time, you ought to be able to support yourself and your family. That seems like a pretty basic, concept. So if that's not happening, then we need to provide a subsidy to make sure that you can live at that level. I think this is one of those where good initial intention, unintended consequences that employers, I'm not sure, I'm not going to say that all of them do it intentionally, but what we have taught them, right, is that, well, I don't necessarily have to pay enough to live above the poverty line. As long as I pay enough that gets somebody in the door, they'll just get government assistance to make up the rest. Now, again,
is that a little bit of moral licensing then by owners?
Yeah.
I mean, it's like, hey, I keep my profit margin up. I keep my stockholders happy.
And they're not
run a business
living in poverty because
my employees are not.
They're not in absolute poverty.
Right.
They've been subsidized by the government. And so they're okay, and I don't have to,
so I can go home and sleep at night
who's being hurt?
Right.
Really, who's being hurt? The taxpayer, but we don't care anyway. Our deficit's through the roof. It's not my problem. My little company, taking, that's not affecting things.
And I'm employing people.
Right. They're coming to work.
Right.
And that's what we say we want.
And I'm making products that the world wants.
And we're making money.
And I'm making money.
So what's bad here?
Yeah.
Of course, the other side of this is then, and this is the part that I think is important to talk about, right, is the author states, it is a myth that wage subsidies like the EITC, quote, make work pay. On the contrary, they make taxpayers pay to rescue workers whose work does not pay enough. nor are such wage subsidies an alternative to welfare. They are welfare in the form of cash rather than in-kind benefits like food stamps or housing vouchers. The term refundable tax credit is just a euphemism for redistributing income. And I think the powerful thing here because there was a lot of ideas in that little blurb there, but the thing that I really took out of it, Lance, is basically what he's telling us, right, is that it's not the companies that end up paying for this. It's the rest of us that end up paying for it. And the irony here, right, is even the companies that are paying you below wages, you're paying taxes on those wages, which is then coming back to you in the form of government subsidies. So it's really not, I mean, yes, do the companies also pay a corporate tax and do, yeah. We've talked about that. They certainly do, right? But we also know that corporations tend to be much better than the average taxpayer at lowering their tax liability.
So in a sense, you and I, some of our tax money is going
We're
to
making
help
up the slack.
These businesses, enabling these businesses to pay their workers less money.
Correct. I mean, that's what
our tax dollars is making up the difference.
Yes.
So instead of the business having to pay more for their workers or to create new inventions,
to innovate,
make it better to do business, they're taking our taxpayer dollars, our hard-earned money, and making more money for the business, for themselves, because they don't have to pay the wages, because the government, which is taxpayers, are going to step in and fill the void. How does that make you feel, folks? Think about that for a little bit.
Which again, I guess I want to stress, I'm not sure that anybody, right, in setting this whole thing up, I don't know that anybody sat there and thought like, oh, this is super clever because look at how this is all going to work. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. The point is, this is an effect, right, of the system that we have. Even if that little business out there is not thinking about the fact that other taxpayers who are making more money are subsidizing them, they may never have consciously thought about that at all, but it doesn't change that that's what's taking place. That's at the end of the day, that is what is happening is the government is subsidizing employers who don't pay their workers enough to live on. And you could say, well, they can't afford to pay them enough to live on. Well, then what does supposedly capitalism, the system that we value that made us, the greatest country in the world say? Then that business should die. That's what it says.
Or we as consumers should pay more for the product.
Right. Either they're going to raise prices and the market will be willing to support the increase in price because we want it bad enough. Or if that's not true, then they will find a cheaper way to produce the product, thereby keeping the cost similar. That could be outsourcing the labor. It could be creating a new invention, improving the efficiency of production, whatever it might be. Or if those two things don't work, or some combination of those two things, raise the price a little bit, innovate a little bit, then the company flops because the market isn't interested in keeping that product. It doesn't really want whatever that thing is bad enough. He claims that inevitably this system generates a two-tier labor force. What do you mean a two-tier labor force? How have we accidentally created a two-tier labor force? Keep it here on the State of Us, and we'll be right back. Michael Lynn's opinion piece in the Wall Street Journal talks about the road to a living wage for all Americans and why our current system doesn't support that. He claims inevitably the system we have creates a two-tier labor force with an underclass of working poor who derive part of their income from employers and part from the government. The fear of being trapped in a low-wage job, this one I about fell out of my chair. The fear of being trapped in a low-wage job fuels credential inflation in the form of unnecessary occupational licensing and the pursuit of a college degree by young people who end up in jobs that do not or should not require one. Credentialism, in turn, prolongs the time that many Americans spend in expensive and often worthless higher education or needless occupational training, forcing them to postpone starting a family or to forego one entirely.
Credentialism gives Justin a new word. And remember, ism is a belief.
That's right.
So a belief in having credentials.
Yes.
Like the more pieces of paper that you get,
the less likely you are to be poor.
Right.
I mean, that's what this is, you know.
That's what the argument is.
That's what the argument is. And I think part of what he's contending here is that when you're subsidizing those low wage jobs, if you see how the second tier system is living, you're very motivated to stay out of that. We've created an entire system of, well, the way to stay out of that, right? The way to avoid that is to be educated enough that you'll never be at one of those employers that doesn't pay you enough to live. And the thing that should irk us all right there is, wait a minute, why are there employers that aren't paying enough for people to live? Instead of, well, the answer is that what we need, if we get more people, more training, more education, more credentials, then they won't be part of this other group over here. But that doesn't do anything to solve the problem of this group. Have we decided that in this country, the only way to stay out of poverty is either to get government assistance or to go to college?
Or get a credential of some kind.
Right,
Go to a trade school, get your technology degree or whatever.
In other words, a high school diploma. I mean, what we're saying in that statement is the only thing a high school diploma is good for is to get a subsidized income from the government.
To keep you above the poverty level.
Right. To keep you from being in absolutely abject poverty, you know?
But see, I want to take it to a level that he didn't talk about in the article. He may talk about it in the book. But since we subsidize lower wages, what happens to the wages we pay for those credentialed workers? Does that affect them as well? Because
yes.
Look, you know, as a non-credentialed worker, you'd only be making this.
Right.
But as a credentialed worker,
so it lets us get away.
We're going to pay you this much. So see how much better you are? But actually, you're just barely living above the poverty level after going into thousands of dollars in debt, possibly.
But we make it all comparison
to get that credential.
Yeah.
Right. But you're going to make.
Well, you're better than these people.
You're going to make $25 an hour rather than $15.
Right.
So look at your credential. Yeah, but you paid $200,000 for your credential.
Right.
So you're going to spend your whole life trying to pay off what got you the higher wage, which really
then begs the question, was it even worth doing that? Or should I just gotten the government subsidized thing?
So because we have low wages at the bottom, it affects the wage scale all the way up. And he doesn't address that, but the answer's got to be yes, right?
But if you're an employee somewhere on the totem pole, you are impacted by this because your credential is becoming devalued. And we've talked about, I don't know how many times on this, right? But because we've also convinced people that now the only way to make sure that you don't end up in that position is to get a credential, we've also forced more people into getting them, which has done what? Devalued the credential. And also supply and demand, our free market, right, has raised the cost. So the cost of a credential is higher and the value is less. And we've sold you on that's really your only option. There's really no other option. If you want to be successful, that's pretty much what you're stuck with. You know, crazy. The other thing that he points out, and this one is another one that I did some math on because I wanted to share it. For the 2022 tax year, 31 million American workers and their children received an average of $2,043 in EITC benefits for a cost to taxpayers of $63 billion. Should we take care of families? Yes. Should we take care of children? Yes. This next part, the beneficial effects often attributed to the EITC, including lifting workers out of poverty, increased employment, and reductions in child neglect and youth services, would also result from higher wages. And needless to say, a job that pays a living wage has a work requirement by definition. I think the point that's being made here, right, Lance, is that does the EITC have some benefits associated with it? Yes. Could we get more benefit investing the money a different way? Yes.
Well, and the idea is if you don't have this government program, then wages would have to go up on their own. I mean, if the government wasn't subsidizing wages
Right.
or living expenses,
but you're not, there's no, why would
there's no reason for the owners to do that, because there are these programs in place that does it for them. But to your point, we could take all of those billions of dollars, billions, correct?
Yeah.
That were being
63 billion, billion with a B.
And even if we didn't do anything with it
a year,
other than put it towards the deficit,
3 billion a
right?
year,
We could lower our deficit. We know that, we're meeting right now to try to make sure we don't default on all the loans, and the United States doesn't become one of those ugly countries that don't pay their debts. We're meeting like crazy. And here's over, $63 billion a year that's spent to subsidize the standard of living. Whereas if that didn't exist, then owners would have to subsidize that. And then we'd all have to pay more for things, but that would be $63 billion a year that we are either saving or, to your point, and this is, I think, what you want to share with the audience, what could we do with that kind of money? Just off the top of your head, Justin, what are some things we could do with $63 billion if everybody made a living wage, and therefore everybody's standard of living would go up, because the higher wage earners would also, if you're an employee, earn more money because you have your credential, so it would become more valuable.
So one of the things that we've spent a lot of time on the show talking about, right, is the value of investing in children, which is part of why the EITC at its face sounds good. Children living in poverty is a bad thing. It decreases their likely earning potential. It hurts their lifelong prospects for health, prosperity, raising a family. All these things, right, are bad. They're bad things. They're bad for the economy. They're bad morally. They're bad. So we've tried to create things to say, well, we don't want kids in poverty, so we're going to do this stuff. Never mind that this system is actually built around, and again, unintended consequence. And I think Lance and I have seen this time and again in working with people who use systems like this. Instead, what happens is people forget a time when they weren't in the system, and they get taught this is how it works, and we never stop to ask, is there a fundamental problem that the system is now holding us into? The system is actually maintaining a problem that doesn't need maintained. So cost-wise, we know that pretty much the most effective time to spend money on a person in this country, right? Like if we're going to invest in a person, a human being in this country, when do we invest the money for the best economic return, the best societal return? It's when they're young, right? That is the best
The earlier, the better.
The earlier, the better.
Because young is like, okay, are you talking about 12? You talking about 8?
Right.
No,
the
younger
sooner, the better.
You can get, right? I mean, we know that, preschool is where the best bang for our tax dollar comes from. The more we would fund preschools, a universal preschool would take care of a plethora of problems for the next 70 years in the lives of those children.
So $63 billion a year would allow you to open across the United States 31,500 youth-serving after-school programs with an annual budget of $2 million apiece. For some perspective, that's 630 after-school youth-serving centers per state. 630. We have 88 counties in our state, in Ohio, just for anybody that wants perspective. So we could have how many? 4 or 5 youth centers a county? I mean, approximately.
So basically, and I understand you're 600 per state, but you have California, you have Florida,
yeah, I mean,
you have New York,
wouldn't be exactly
then you
like
have Wyoming.
You don't need 600 in North Dakota.
Exactly. But what you're averaging here is you could have a youth center for every 3,000 young people, school-aged children. Wow. With a $2 million budget.
Well, and keep in mind, you might say, okay, well, 3,000 at a single center, that sounds like a lot. Well, right, but not all 3,000 need that. And that's everybody 0 to 18. If we take that down further, Lance, right, and we say just those that are in poverty, just hypothetically, right? So according to the U.S. Census Bureau, Lance, the national child poverty rate was 16.9%. So we'll just call it 17%, right? So if you're saying, and again, these are rough numbers here, folks, but if there's 3,000 kids per center, 17% of those are in poverty. That means each center needs to serve about 510 kids. And
on a $2 million budget?
On a $2 million budget, which, mind you, Lance and I work at a youth center that has about a $200,000 a year budget, and our membership is $660. So I think that with $2 million a year,
on a tenth of the budget,
right? On a tenth of the budget, we're serving more than the average
and making
minimum.
Changes in young people's lives.
Yeah.
So what could we do with? You say, well, why do you need then $2 million? Well, we didn't say we needed it.
This is just an example.
But what could you do with it? And how many more students of that 600 that we serve could we be helping?
So if you want to give them a $1 million budget, right, then it's 63,000 youth centers across the United States, or 1,200 per state, which equates to about one youth center serving 250 kids.
And that one-on-one with kids who need help is imperative. And it's what the schools can't do.
Yep.
And again, this is just one thing that you can do.
I mean, there's lots
with
of things.
$63 billion.
But you talk about a profound
effect
on national
local communities.
change.
Right. On communities throughout the country. Whether you're a big city or you're a farm community like we are, or something in between, just we could be helping. All these newspaper articles, or when you're watching the news, you're seeing all these horrible things that are happening with young people. We wouldn't solve all of them, but we could address many of them if we spent the money that way. Because, hey, pay attention to the news. It's working now, isn't it? Right? I mean, we all know that things are really going well right now. So let's keep the current system because it's really helping.
Yeah.
Okay. Sarcasm dripping, okay, all over that comment. Hopefully you understand that insanity, right? Keep doing the same thing and hope for a different result. Things obviously with young people are not working right now. So what's the harm in trying something else? I don't know about you, but just one aspect Justin brought up to you, sir. I am torn to my heart of listening to the news or reading my phone or the newspaper and hearing about another teenage shooter. Can we, if there were youth centers, and you're saying, well, you're making a jump now, give me a chance, right?
Yeah.
Give me a chance.
I don't think it's that much of a jump.
Have the youth centers and give me a chance to see if I can help, and if we see helping young people and see the number of teenage shooters and see what happens to that number. Okay? Because we know what we're seeing right now. I sure as heck think we in the youth center business could do a whole lot better than what we're doing right now. Don't think we'd be any worse. Anyway.
Crime and poverty tend to go down when kids are kept busy after school.
And we know that,
and they
right?
go up when they have nothing to do and no one to spend time with.
And the numbers are out there for kids who participate in after school activities, whether at a youth center or at school.
We've
whether
known
it's
this
band
for
or sports.
decades and
That's
decades
something
and decades.
nobody argues that, right? Again, to your bipartisanship.
Yeah.
Nobody on either side of the aisle argues that. We all know. Now, how do you get kids involved? And we also know that youth sports are going down in this country. All right. Everybody agrees that. What are we going to do to get more kids involved? So again, Justin doesn't like, this cause and effect, what is it? You always say correlation does not. We wouldn't solve all of them, but we could address many of them if we spent the money that way. Because, hey, pay attention to the news. It's working now, isn't it? Right? I mean, we all know that things are really going well right now. So let's keep the current system because it's really helping.
Yeah.
Okay. Sarcasm dripping, okay, all over that comment. Hopefully you understand that insanity, right? Keep doing the same thing and hope for a different result. Things obviously with young people are not working right now. So what's the harm in trying something else? I don't know about you, but just one aspect Justin brought up to you, sir. I am torn to my heart of listening to the news or reading my phone or the newspaper and hearing about another teenage shooter. can we use, if there were youth centers, and you're saying, well, you're making a jump now, give me a chance, right?
Yeah.
Give me a chance.
I don't think it's that much of a jump.
Have the youth centers and give me a chance to see if I can help, and if we see helping young people and see the number of teenage shooters and see what happens to that number. Okay? Because we know what we're seeing right now. I sure as heck think we in the youth center business could do a whole lot better than what we're doing right now. Don't think we'd be any worse. Anyway.
Crime and poverty tend to go down when kids are kept busy after school.
And we know that,
and they
right?
go up when they have nothing to do and no one to spend time with.
And the numbers are out there for kids who participate in after school activities, whether at a youth center or at school,
We've
whether
known
it's
this
band
for
or sports.
decades and
That's
decades
something
and decades.
nobody argues that, right? Again, to your bipartisanship.
Yeah.
Nobody on either side of the aisle argues that. We all know. Now, how do you get kids involved? And we also know that youth sports are going down in this country. All right. That's, everybody agrees that. What are we going to do to get more kids involved? So again, Justin doesn't like, this cause and effect, what is it? You always say correlation does not necessarily equal causation. There you go. But we have fewer and fewer young people involved in after school activities, and more criminal activity and anxiety and mental health issues with young people. Again, you can rant at me if you think I'm making leaps of faith here, but I really think the numbers prove it out. Let's talk about our dynamic capitalist system and how we're circumventing it. Keep it here on The State of Us. We'll be right back. Our dynamic capitalist system has raised living standards for generations, not by lowering wages, but by lowering prices with new technology and innovative business models. One of the greatest harms of the low-wage, high-welfare system is the damage it does to technological innovation. Many studies consistently show that increases in labor costs, whether caused by tight labor markets, higher minimum wages, immigration restrictions, unionization, or other factors, prompt businesses to adopt labor-saving technologies. A 2022 study by the Federal Reserve Bank observed that, quote, the option to automate may become particularly attractive in a tight labor market in which competition for hiring adds pressure for firms to raise wages, end quote. In manufacturing, where machines often complement rather than replace workers, employment can remain the same or even grow if the market for the industry's goods or services expands. Where technology substitutes for labor and demand is fixed, as in the case of kiosks in fast food restaurants or self-service checkout in retail, workers may be replaced altogether, just as multitudes of farm workers gave way to mechanical harvesters and typesetters lost out to publishing software. But automation also produces lower prices, which gives consumers more discretionary income to spend on goods and services in other labor-intensive sectors. Jobs in these fields can absorb many of the workers displaced by technological progress. Do people get left behind in technological progress? Yes. Is the answer to stop technological progress? You can't. Well, and we're all living longer because we found better, quicker ways to produce food. And so did it mean that thousands of farmers lost their jobs? Yes. But did that then help society? Yes. And then what do those workers do? Those farmers go find something else to do, which then helps the economy. So at least that's the argument. And it's a fair point. And none of us like to lose our jobs. All right. But if the technology helps everybody, and this is me saying this, right? If it's for the betterment of society, then the workers in those fields go somewhere else. And the government's done this for decades. It's called job training. Retrain the workforce. Okay. And I'm sure we could use some of that $68 billion to make that happen. And if you've been working for any amount of time, 20 years plus at least, I mean, that's easy. you've had to go through some job training to keep the job you have. I know I did as a school teacher. I had to learn how to use a computer. I had to learn how to use a smart board. I had to learn when I went to college, none of those things existed. So there was all this technology that I learned in college that no longer existed once I was halfway through my career. So we all go through that job training, whether you get to stay in your chosen profession or not. We all go through it. So why bash on technology? Because what it does is it makes prices cheaper and is for the betterment of the individuals within society. And then workers go to many times a new field that's been created by the technology.
If a living wage for all workers is the goal, there is plenty of room for debate about how to get there. One-size-fits-all policies like a higher federal minimum wage should be the last resort, given the wide variation in living costs across the country. Geez, sound like something that we've been saying for years about. You can increase minimum wage.
Go back to the archives if that's a new show for you. We've done it at least a dozen times.
But you don't blanket that. The answer is not a blanket minimum wage. It's a regionally adjusted cost of living.
It doesn't
system.
cost as much to live in the Midwest as it does on the coast. So why should there be a federal minimum wage?
If the federal minimum wage is how you're determining what people get paid, you're either not paying people enough who live in high cost areas, or you're way overpaying and thereby killing business in areas that don't need to be paid that much. So it's not good for anybody.
And again, the concept of a minimum wage, there's that argument I don't believe is bad, but it shouldn't be blanketed. It should be based on what is the poverty. Neither should there be a federal poverty level, because you could be making $40,000 a year and living in poverty in Southern California.
Yeah.
And $40,000 a year in Champaign County would put you living a fairly nice life. I mean,
it'd put you in the middle class life here.
Right, a middle class life
and
here.
It'd put you
poverty in New York City or Los Angeles. So you can't, so it's really not even fair when we talk about a poverty level or a minimum wage nationally, because we don't all have the same cost of living.
The other thing is, I ran some numbers, Lance. We talked about youth centers in the last segment. We talk about return, right? I mean, what do we get for what we put in? Some could argue that we really don't get any return on the $63 billion spent on the earned income tax credit, because all we're doing, right, is subsidizing what otherwise should have been paid out by companies in the first place. That's all we're doing. We're just making up lost ground. So I guess if we want to be generous, you could say $63 billion returns $63 billion, because, we're at the very least, we're breaking even on, we're making sure that people got what they're supposed to. They're going to go out and spend that money. Great. There's $63 billion that's in the economy that wouldn't have been if we hadn't spent that money. You could probably argue that it's a little higher than that, because, if you keep people out of poverty, then maybe they can lift themselves out of poverty. And I know the argument, right? But we also know that there's still 17% of kids living in poverty. So clearly, if this was the solution, we shouldn't still have 17% of kids living in poverty. On the other hand, we know, based on research from the After School Alliance, that after school programming for children set up in a specific range of areas will provide a $3 return for every $1 invested. So that means if we invested $63 billion a year,